The fence posts were already in the ground when Susan Merritt came riding back from Caldwell's dry goods store, her wagon rattling over the hard-packed dirt road that curved toward her property line. She pulled the reins hard, and her old bay mare, Clover, whinnied and stamped her hooves in the sudden stop. Susan's dark eyes went wide, her breath catching somewhere between her ribs as she stared at the raw cedar posts lined up in a perfect, unbroken row stretching from the eastern corner of her land, all the way to where the creek bent south. And there was Marcus Wallace, the sheriff of Dorado Flats, Texas, driving the next post into the ground with a steel-headed mallet, his broad shoulders working in steady, powerful strokes, his badge catching the October sun of 1883 like a mirror flashing a secret signal. Something inside Susan cracked wide open, and it was not gratitude. It was fury. She jumped down from the wagon before Clover had fully stopped moving, her boots hitting the ground so hard the impact rang up through her knees, and she walked toward that man with every ounce of the rage she had been storing for the past 3 months pressing against the backs of her teeth. "Marcus Wallace," she said, and her voice came out quieter than she intended, which somehow made it worse, sharper, the kind of quiet that precedes thunder. "What in the name of God do you think you are doing on my property?" He straightened slowly. He always moved slowly, not because he was lazy or unsure, but because Marcus Wallace was the kind of man who believed that a man who moved too fast was a man hiding something from himself. He turned to look at her, and his gray eyes were steady and calm and utterly unafraid of her anger, which made that anger burn hotter. "Building a fence," he said simply. "I can see that," she said. "I am asking you why." He took off his hat, held it in both hands, and looked at her with something in his expression that she could not immediately name, because she had spent 3 months very carefully refusing to look at his face long enough to learn its vocabulary. "Because Harlan Dodd's cattle have been cutting through the southwest corner and tearing up your winter wheat. Because I watched from the ridge 2 weeks ago and counted 19 head of Dodd's stock grazing on land you paid for, and planted and worked every single day since your husband passed. Because I asked Dodd to fence his own side, and he told me that a widow woman alone out here ought to be grateful his cattle were the only things crossing her land at night." Susan went absolutely still. The wind moved through the dry grass around them. In the distance, a mockingbird ran through its borrowed repertoire of other birds' songs. "You talked to Dodd," she said. "I did. Without telling me." Marcus put his hat back on. "I told him to handle it by September's end. He did not, so here I am." And there it was. That was the thing about Marcus Wallace that made Susan Merritt's chest feel like a knot she could not untangle. He did not ask. He did not explain himself in advance. He simply saw what needed doing, and he did it quietly, without ceremony, as though the world were a broken thing that he had personally accepted responsibility for mending. It was noble and infuriating in equal, perfectly balanced measure. "Take the posts up," she said. He blinked. "Just once." "Pardon me?" "I said take them up. This is my land, Sheriff, mine. I decide what gets built on it and what does not. I decide when I need help, and I decide who provides it. Not you. Not anyone who has not been invited." He was quiet for a long moment. The mallet hung loosely from his right hand. She watched something move through his expression the way weather moves through a valley, rolling and complex and impossible to stop midway through. "All right," he said finally. "I will pull them up." She had not expected him to agree. She had braced herself for an argument, for him to tell her she was being stubborn or foolish or irrational, and she had her counter-arguments lined up like soldiers. His simple, flat compliance knocked all of them sideways. She stood there with the wind pulling strands of dark hair across her face, and did not say anything. "But I am coming back tomorrow," he said, and he said it the same way he said everything, without threat or apology, just plain truth laid on the table like a hand of cards. "And I am bringing the posts with me, and I am going to stand at the edge of your property line, and I am going to ask you properly if I may build this fence. And if you say no, I will take every piece of cedar back to my wagon, and I will never mention it again." She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Fine," she said, and she walked back to her wagon, climbed up to the seat and drove Clover home without looking back once. Though she wanted to. She wanted to very badly, and that was the part she hated most. To understand what brought Susan Merritt to that October afternoon on the edge of her own land, staring down the most quietly stubborn man in Comanche County, you had to go back to the spring of 1882, to a morning that smelled like sage and fresh mud and the beginning of something irreversible. Susan had come to Dorado Flats, Texas, not as a bride, not as a daughter, but as a widow. She had married Thomas Merritt in St. Louis in 1878 when she was 23, and Thomas was 31. Thomas had been a good man in the way that a well-made tool is good, reliable and honest, and utterly without surprise. They had moved to Texas because Thomas had a dream about land, about the kind of permanence you could only get by planting yourself in the earth and staying put, while everything else moved around you. He had filed a claim on 160 acres of grassland south of Dorado Flats under the Homestead Act, and they had built a small house together, and Thomas had worked that land like a man trying to prove something to the sky. In the spring of 1881, Thomas was thrown from a horse while checking the south fence. He landed badly. The doctor from Caldwell rode out but arrived 2 days too late to do anything except confirm what Susan already knew. Thomas died on a Wednesday. She buried him under the old post oak at the western edge of the property, where he used to sit in the evenings and watch the sun go down over the flat horizon. She was 26 years old, alone in Texas, with no family within 1,000 miles and 160 acres that she had no intention of abandoning. The people of Dorado Flats, to their credit, came to help in the first weeks after Thomas died. The women from the Methodist Church brought food. The men helped with the spring planting. But sympathy has a shelf life in a frontier town, and by summer the town had turned its attention back to its own survival, and Susan had turned hers to the difficult, grinding business of proving that a woman alone could hold land. She could. She learned quickly, and she worked tirelessly, and she refused help that came with the implied price of her dependence. By the summer of 1882, she had a kitchen garden, a small wheat crop, 6 chickens, and a reputation in town as the Merritt widow, spoken with a mixture of respect and wariness that she had chosen to wear like armor. Marcus Wallace had arrived in Dorado Flats in the autumn of 1882, appointed by the county commissioner to replace the previous sheriff, who had retired to live with his daughter in San Antonio. Marcus was 32 years old, originally from Kentucky, and had spent 6 years as a deputy in Abilene before taking the post in Dorado Flats. He was tall and lean in the way of men who move constantly and eat whatever is available. He had gray eyes and dark hair going silver at the temples, even though he was not yet old enough to have earned it. He had a mouth that looked severe in repose and unexpectedly warm when he smiled, which was not often but which, when it happened, had the quality of sunlight appearing suddenly through cloud cover. Susan noticed him the first Sunday he attended church services in October of 1882. She noticed him the way she would have noticed any new element introduced into a familiar environment, with cataloging attention and no particular emotional investment. He sat at the end of the third pew and held his hat in his lap, and looked at the preacher with the same expression he apparently brought to everything in his life, steady, careful, taking it all in. Reverend Hayes introduced him to the congregation afterward, and Marcus shook hands with every person in the churchyard with that economy of motion that was already becoming his trademark. When he got to Susan, he took her hand and said, "Mrs. Merritt, I know your land. I rode by it when I first came through. Good soil along the south quarter," and then he moved on to the next person. She stood there for a moment in the churchyard, holding the hand he was no longer holding, and felt irrationally irritated that he had noticed her soil before he had noticed her. Which was, she told herself firmly, entirely appropriate, which was what she wanted. Over the following months, Marcus Wallace became a fixture in Dorado Flats the way good things become fixtures, not through force or dramatic arrival, but through consistent, quiet presence. He settled disputes fairly. He tracked down a ring of horse thieves operating through the Cimarron River basin and brought them to justice with minimal violence and a maximum of careful planning. He stopped a gunfight between two cattlemen over a water rights argument by sitting down with both men at the same table and staying there until they reached an agreement, which took most of a Saturday. He also, apparently, kept a quiet eye on Susan's property. She did not know this until much later. She thought, during that winter and into the spring of 1883, that she simply occasionally encountered the sheriff during her trips to town. She did not realize that he had adjusted his patrol routes to pass her access road twice a week. She did not realize that, when Harlan Dodd's foreman had made a comment at the hardware store about widow women not knowing how to manage land, Marcus had gone and had a private conversation with that foreman that resulted in the man leaving Dorado Flats entirely by the following Friday. What Susan knew of Marcus Wallace in those early months was only what was visible on the surface. He was fair. He was disciplined. He had a dark past that he did not discuss, the kind you could sense the outline of without seeing the details, the way you can feel the shape of furniture in a dark room. He had never married. He ate supper most evenings alone at the Blue Star Hotel's dining room, reading whatever book he had borrowed from the lending library that the schoolteacher, Miss Holt, maintained. He did not drink to excess. He did not gamble for more than he could afford to lose, and he rarely gambled at all. Susan knew these things the way you know things in a small town, through accumulated fragments, through overheard conversations and the testimony of others, through the particular intimacy of a community small enough that everyone's life is partially visible to everyone else whether they invite the visibility or not. She also knew, and this was the thing she refused to examine too directly, that whenever Marcus Wallace came into a room she was occupying, her awareness of every other element in that room shifted slightly, as though he were a weather system with his own gravitational field. She refused this knowledge. She put it in a box and put the box in a place she did not visit. Thomas had been gone just over a year. She was not ready. She was not sure she would ever be ready. And even if she were ready someday, she was not going to allow herself to be the kind of woman who needed someone. She had learned in the hard school of Thomas's death that needing someone was the most dangerous thing a person could do, because the person you needed could be taken away by a horse on an ordinary spring morning. And then where were you? Then where were you? The fence argument, that October confrontation, did not come from nothing. It came from 3 months of careful distance-keeping that had become increasingly difficult to maintain. It came from the fact that in July, when her kitchen garden's irrigation channel had collapsed after a heavy rain, Marcus had appeared within the hour with a shovel and a spare set of work clothes, and had quietly redug the channel without being asked. And she had stood on her porch watching him, and felt something crack in the careful architecture of her self-sufficiency. She had thanked him with excessive formality, and he had nodded and left, and she had spent the next 3 days furious with herself for the crack, and by extension furious with him for causing it. She knew with the honest part of her mind that she could not entirely silence, terrified. Not of Marcus Wallace in the conventional sense, terrified of wanting something again, terrified of standing over another grave under another post oak saying goodbye to another person she had let herself need. So when he appeared on her property line in October with cedar posts and a steel mallet, she had not reacted to the fence. She had reacted to the fact that she had wanted him to be there. She had wanted it so badly, and the wanting had frightened her so thoroughly, that the only thing she could do was direct that fear outward in the form of anger. This was the truth. She knew it. She put it in the box and went home and made supper and told herself she had handled it perfectly. She slept very poorly that night. Marcus Wallace drove home from Susan Merritt's property line in the early dark of the October evening, with the cedar posts loaded back into his wagon, exactly as she had demanded, and he felt the weight of what had just happened settling across his shoulders like a yoke. He did not believe he had done the wrong thing. He believed, in fact, that building that fence was one of the most straightforwardly right things he had done since arriving in Dorado Flats. But he also understood, with the bone-deep comprehension that came from having spent his life studying people the way a tracker studies ground, that being right was not always the point. Susan Merritt was not a woman who needed saving. This was part of what drew him to her with an intensity that had surprised him when he first began to understand it, because Marcus Wallace had not expected, at 32, to be pulled toward any particular person with this kind of persistent magnetic force. He had been careful with himself in that regard. His past had made him careful. He had been engaged once in Abilene to a woman named Clara Voss, who was lovely and spirited, and who had ultimately decided that the life of a lawman's wife, with its specific rations of loneliness and fear, was not a life she could accept. She had gone to Denver and married a banker, and Marcus did not blame her. He had, in fact, felt a kind of relief in the clarity of her departure, because the truth was he had not been sure he loved her, only that he had been drawn to the idea of the life they might have built. The lesson of Clara was not about heartbreak. The lesson was about the difference between settling for something acceptable and waiting for something that felt as necessary as breathing. Susan Merritt felt as necessary as breathing. This had crept up on him so gradually that, by the time he recognized it, it was already a fact about himself as established as the color of his eyes. He had not acted on it immediately because he was not a man who acted on things immediately, and because he read Susan's careful distance with the attention he brought to all things, and understood that she was a woman who had been broken by loss and had reconstructed herself using self-sufficiency as the primary building material. To approach her without extraordinary care would be to dismantle what she had worked so hard to build. He did not intend to dismantle anything. He intended to add to it if she would allow him. The fence had been his first concrete move, and he had miscalculated, not in the idea itself but in the execution. He had not asked. He had assumed, with a kind of certainty that he now recognized as arrogance, that she would be grateful. Instead, he had threatened the most fundamental thing she possessed, her authority over her own life and land. So he thought carefully that night, sitting at his desk in the sheriff's office after supper, the lamp burning low, a cup of coffee going cold at his elbow. He thought about Susan Merritt and the way she had looked at him in the October light, furious and alive, and so completely herself, that he had to keep his hands very still at his sides to prevent them from reaching for her. He thought about the box she had clearly built around whatever she felt, and the way the lid of that box had been visibly rattling in that confrontation. He was going to build that fence. He was going to do it the right way. The next morning, Marcus arrived at Susan's property line at 8:30. He had a wagon full of cedar posts, a mallet, wire, and tools. He climbed down from the wagon, walked to her front door, and knocked. Susan answered after a pause that was long enough to tell him she had seen him coming and had been deciding. Her dark hair was pinned up but not quite tightly enough, and she was wearing a work dress the color of old wheat. She looked at him with an expression calibrated to communicate that she was not impressed, which he noticed she was working to maintain. "Good morning, Mrs. Merritt," he said. He held his hat in both hands. "I told you I would come back and ask properly. So here I am, asking. Your southwest corner has been breached repeatedly by Dodd's cattle. I would like your permission to build a fence along your western and southern property line, using cedar posts and wire. It would take me and one other man approximately 2 days. I will cover the cost of the materials myself, as it should have been Dodd's responsibility to fix this, and he failed to act. But I will not begin until you say yes, and if you say no, I will load everything back on the wagon and drive away." He stopped. He waited. He did not fill the silence with additional argument. She studied him for a long moment. The morning light was slanted and gold and cast long shadows across the dry grass of her yard. A chicken wandered past in the middle distance, completely indifferent to the tension between them. "You said one other man," she said. "Pete Haverson, my deputy. He is a reliable hand with a post-hole digger." "How do I know the fence will be built straight?" she said. "Along the actual property line. I have the survey map from the county land office. I marked the corners last spring when I was reviewing homestead claims in the area. I know exactly where your line runs." She looked at him very carefully. "Why do you have my survey map?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because when I first arrived in Dorado Flats, I made it my business to understand the land around the town. Who held what the boundaries were. The Dodd property butts up against yours on two sides. I knew early on that there would be a dispute eventually. Dodd is not a careful neighbor." "Have you looked into Dodd's operations otherwise?" she asked. "That is a separate matter," he said, "and one I am currently attending to, but it is not why I am here today." She looked at him for another long moment, then she stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "There is coffee." He followed her inside into the small, orderly house that she had clearly worked hard to make into something more than a survival outpost. There were blue curtains at the windows that she must have made herself. There was a shelf of books, a proper iron cookstove, a scrubbed pine table. On the windowsill above the kitchen basin, there was a single glass jar with late autumn wildflowers in it, the last ragged survivors of the season. She poured coffee into 2 cups without asking him how he took it, which told him she already knew, which told him she had been paying attention to the details of him in the same way he had been paying attention to hers. He felt something warm and precarious settle in his chest. He sat at the table. She sat across from him. Outside, Clover moved in the small corral and a hawk cried somewhere high above the grassland. "All right," she said. "You can build the fence." He nodded. "Thank you." "But," she said, and the word landed with emphasis, "I want to be there while you are doing it. I want to see every post go in. I want to know the measurements." "I would not have it any other way," he said. She looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup, and something in her dark eyes shifted, something minute and almost invisible like the first small crack in ice that carries within it the eventual promise of spring. "You are not what I expected from a sheriff," she said. "What did you expect?" "Someone who would tell me what was good for me without asking what I thought." He wrapped both hands around his cup. "I have met sheriffs like that," he said. "I have not found it to be an effective approach. People generally know what is good for them better than outsiders assume." She was quiet for a moment, watching him. "What happened in your past, Sheriff Wallace?" The question came out of nowhere, or rather, out of the particular frankness that he had come to understand was one of Susan Merritt's defining characteristics. She was not a woman who approached things sideways. When she wanted to know something, she asked. He appreciated this about her even as the question landed somewhere sensitive. "What makes you think something happened?" he said. "You have the look of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time," she said simply. "I recognize it. I see it in the mirror." He was quiet for a moment. He set his cup down. "I was a deputy in Abilene for 6 years," he said. "Before Abilene, I was in Kentucky. I had a younger brother named Daniel. He fell in with a group of men I could not protect him from, men I should have seen coming sooner than I did. I was young, and I believed my position would insulate my family from the consequences of those men. It did not. Daniel died when I was 23. He was 19. Susan said nothing. She did not offer the usual hollow condolences. She simply held the weight of what he had said with the same quiet steadiness she apparently brought to all difficult things. "I came west because I needed to do something that mattered," he said. "I did not want to spend my life standing over ground where I had failed. I wanted to be useful somewhere I had not yet made my worst mistakes." "Has it worked?" she asked. "Parts of it," he said. And then, because he was a man who believed in the precision of honesty, mostly. She looked at him for a long time. Then she picked up her coffee cup and drank, and whatever had been open between them for those few minutes closed gently, like a door that is shut not in rejection, but in the acknowledgement that certain things need more time before they can be continued. "I will be outside at 8 tomorrow morning," she said. "Do not be late." "I am never late," he said, and he meant it as a simple statement of fact, but she smiled briefly, quickly, like the mockingbird's borrowed songs, and it hit him somewhere directly under the sternum. He drove away with his wagon full of cedar posts and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt like tomorrow was a thing worth waking up for. The fence building took 2.5 days, not 2, because on the second afternoon a late October storm rolled in from the northwest and turned the ground to clay that grabbed at the post hole digger and refused to release it without a fight. Pete Haverson, the deputy, a cheerful young man of 25 from Tennessee with enormous hands and a complete inability to understand why he should not make conversation at every available opportunity, worked steadily and well, and talked enough for all three of them. Susan was there every morning at 8 as promised. She had brought the county survey map inside and studied it the night before Marcus arrived, and when he unrolled his own copy on the hood of the wagon the first morning, she was ready to compare them, to ask about the eastern corner marker, to identify the place where the line curved slightly to follow the creek. He answered every question with the same patient, thorough attention, treating her knowledge of her own land as a resource rather than an inconvenience. By noon of the first day, they had developed a working rhythm. She would watch the line, call out adjustments when a post was not quite on the mark. He would make the adjustments without comment. Pete would drive the posts. When the storm came on the second day, and they were forced under the shelter of the porch overhang with cups of coffee that Susan had made without being asked, Pete talked about his mother's kitchen in Tennessee and a girl he was fond of in town. And Marcus and Susan sat on opposite ends of the porch bench and watched the rain come down in silver sheets across the grassland. And the nearness of him, the solid, unhurried reality of his presence, did things to Susan's carefully ordered internal architecture that she was no longer fully able to dismiss. On the third morning, Pete's youngest sister arrived at the sheriff's office in a state of some distress about a dispute with her landlord, and Pete was obliged to go back to town. Marcus drove out to Susan's property alone. She came out of the house when she heard the wagon. He climbed down, began unloading the last of the posts. She put on her work gloves and picked up the other end of the first post. He looked at her. She looked at him. "We will finish faster with 2, she said. They worked together all morning. It was harder work than directing from the side, and Susan found herself pleased by the hard work, by the way her muscles remembered the weight of real effort, by the specific satisfaction of each post going solidly into the ground. They did not talk much. They did not need to. There was a conversation happening between them that was conducted entirely in the language of shared effort and proximity, and the occasional brush of a hand reaching for the same tool. At midday, she made lunch. There was not a formal decision that he should stay for it. It simply became apparent that he was not leaving and she was not asking him to, and the cornbread and cold beans and sliced salt pork appeared on the table as naturally as everything else they had accomplished together that morning. "Tell me about Kentucky," she said, passing him the cornbread. "Before everything changed." He thought about it. "Green," he said. "Everything green and enormous. I have never gotten entirely used to Texas. The sky here is too wide." Everything in Kentucky had something taller than itself nearby. Here everything is the same height as everything else. He paused. "But there is an honesty to it. The land does not pretend to be more than it is." "That is why I stayed," she said. "After Thomas, people ask me to go back to St. Louis, back to my family, but this land is honest. It does not make promises it cannot keep. What you put in, you get out. What you neglect, you lose. There is no mystery about it." "Thomas was a good man," Marcus said. "He was a very good man," she said, and the past tense did not cost her the way it once had. "He was not complicated. He loved straightforwardly and he worked honestly and he died before he was ready, which is the most ordinary and most terrible thing that can happen. Marcus looked at her. "You have not let yourself stop since he died," he said. "It was not a question." "No," she said. "Stopping would have been the end of me." "Is stopping still dangerous?" he said. The question hung in the kitchen air between them, large and specific and impossible to mistake for anything other than what it was. She looked at him across the pine table, and for the first time she let herself look for long enough to read his face the way she had been refusing to. And what she found there was not pressure or demand or the expectation of anything she had not chosen to give. What she found was something patient and steady and warm, and so carefully contained that she understood suddenly that it had been there a long time, waiting without requiring her to notice it. "I do not know yet," she said honestly. He nodded. He took a piece of cornbread. "Fair enough," he said. They went back to work after lunch. The last section of fence went in before sundown, running along the southern line from the creek bend to the old boundary marker that Thomas had set with a pile of field stones in 1879. Marcus stretched the wire between the posts, checked the tension, tested the line's strength. Susan walked the length of the entire fence, touching each post as she passed it, feeling the solidity of it. She stopped at the far end and stood looking back along the line of posts stretching toward the house, and she felt something unexpected. She felt safe. Not the narrow, exhausted safety of a woman alone defending what she had, but a wider, warmer safety, the kind that comes from knowing exactly where you stand and having that knowledge confirmed by something visible and solid in the world. She turned and found Marcus standing behind her at a respectful distance, watching her with those gray eyes that missed nothing. "You built it straight," she said. "Along your line," he said. "Every post on your ground." She looked at the fence for another moment. Then she looked at him. "Thank you, Marcus," she said, and she used his given name for the first time naturally, without ceremony, and the effect of it on his expression was something she would carry with her for a very long time. "You are welcome, Susan," he said. They stood there in the long October light with the fence between them and the grassland stretching away in every direction, and the world felt very large and very open, and for the first time in a long time, full of something that might be possibility. Dorado Flats, Texas in November 1883 was not a peaceful town, though it wore the appearance of one the way a rattlesnake holds perfectly still in warm grass. The trouble had a name, Harlan Dodd. Or rather, the trouble had a face, and that face was Harlan Dodd's, but the roots of the trouble went deeper than one bad-tempered cattle baron. Dodd had arrived in Comanche County in 1879 with money and men, and the particular confidence of a man who had learned that the law, properly managed, was a tool like any other. The previous sheriff, a man named Bowen, had understood this arrangement and had been well compensated for his understanding. Dodd's cattle grazed wherever they wanted. His men settled disputes with their fists and occasionally with worse, and the town had grown accustomed to a low-level climate of intimidation that it had gradually stopped naming out loud. Marcus Wallace had not been briefed on this arrangement when he took the post. Or rather, he had been briefed on it obliquely by the county commissioner, who had chosen words with such careful ambiguity that Marcus had left the meeting understanding only that Dodd was a significant figure in the county, whose interests required consideration. Marcus had considered them and found them not particularly compelling. He had begun, quietly and methodically, gathering information about Dodd's operations. What he found was not unexpected, but was nonetheless serious. Dodd had been running cattle across at least 7 homestead claims without authorization. 2 families had sold their claims and left the county after sustained pressure that Marcus, retrospectively, identified as deliberate intimidation. There were questions about how Dodd had acquired his water rights to Creosote Creek, the main water source for the south half of the county, that the original documentation did not fully answer. Susan's land, with its access to the southern bend of Creosote Creek, was relevant to Dodd's ambitions in a way that Marcus had understood from early on. He did not tell Susan this immediately, partly because he did not yet have enough to present in court and partly because he was still untangling the full shape of it. This, he later acknowledged to himself, was a mistake of a different kind than the fence. He was protecting her by withholding information, which was exactly the kind of paternalistic decision he had criticized others for making. The situation came to a head in November, 3 weeks after the fence went up. Dodd's foreman, a big, humorless man named Creech, rode up to Susan's fence on a gray morning and cut the wire in 2 places. He did it in daylight, making no effort to hide it. He left a note tied to a fence post. The note said that widow women who could not manage their own affairs would find their affairs managed for them. Susan rode to town with the note folded in her coat pocket. She walked into Marcus's office and put it on his desk. He read it. He did not say anything immediately. He read it a second time and then set it down and looked up at her. He cut the wire, she said, 2 sections on the south side. I will fix the wire, he said, after I deal with Creech. I want to know, Susan said, and the careful calm of her voice was the same quiet before thunder he had heard in October. Everything you know about Harlan Dodd's interest in my property. Right now. Not the parts you have decided to protect me from, all of it. He met her eyes. He had known this moment was coming and he had known he deserved it. Sit down, he said. I would rather stand. So he told her, standing across the desk from each other, the whole of what he had pieced together. The pattern of pressure on homesteaders with creek access. The water rights question. The fact that her land with the south bend of the creek was the last significant obstacle between Dodd's east and west holdings that he had not yet absorbed. The fact that the note from Creech was not a threat but an opening offer, and that if she did not respond to it with unmistakable firmness, there would be more offers of a similar or more aggressive kind. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. How long have you known this? She said. The full picture has been clear for about 6 weeks, he said, and you did not tell me. I was building a case, he said. I was trying to have something solid before I brought it to you. She looked at him with the measured, direct gaze that he had come to understand was her version of taking careful aim. That was not your decision to make, she said. This concerns my land and my safety. I was owed the information when you had it. You are right, he said. I am sorry. She blinked. She had clearly expected more resistance, and his immediate, unqualified agreement caught her again, the same way it had in October, off her prepared ground. I will not do it again, he said. Everything I know from this point forward, you know. Good, she said. She picked up the note from the desk and put it back in her coat pocket. What is the legal remedy? Creech destroyed your fence, which is destruction of property. I can arrest him for that, but Dodd will bail him out within the day and nothing meaningful will change. The larger issue is the water rights question. I have been in correspondence with the County Land Registry in Austin, and I believe there are irregularities in Dodd's water rights documentation that can be challenged. How long will that take? The legal process will take months, he said honestly, possibly longer. In the meantime, I need to make it very clear to Dodd that his approach to this situation has changed. He has been accustomed to a certain kind of law in this county. He needs to understand that that is no longer the law that applies. And how do you intend to make that clear? He was quiet for a moment. I am going to arrest Creech today, and then I am going to ride out to Dodd's ranch and have a conversation with him. I am coming with you to Dodd's ranch, Susan said. That is not necessary, he said, and then caught himself immediately. It is your right if you choose it, but I want to be honest with you. Dodd is not a man who responds well to being confronted by the person he considers the weaker party in a dispute. He may say things specifically intended to provoke or distress you. Let him try, Susan said. He looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said. We leave at 2 o'clock. They rode out to Dodd's ranch in the middle of the afternoon, Susan on Clover, Marcus on his tall black gelding named Reason, which was either ironic or entirely fitting depending on your perspective. Creech had already been collected from a saloon on Main Street by Pete Haverson, and was sitting in the jail cell reviewing his choices. Dodd's ranch house was a large, stone and timber structure set back from the road behind a line of cottonwoods that had been planted by the previous owner of the land. Dodd himself appeared on the porch when he heard them coming, a heavy-set man in his late 40s with a gray beard and the kind of eyes that had practiced expressing nothing for so long they had actually achieved it. Marcus introduced himself formally and stated his purpose. Creech was in custody for destruction of Mrs. Merritt's property. Marcus intended to press the charge fully. Furthermore, he was placing Dodd on notice that any further interference with Mrs. Merritt's land, her fence, her water access, or her person or property in any form would be treated as a criminal matter under Texas law. Dodd listened to all of this with the patience of a man who believed very firmly that this conversation was temporary. He looked at Susan with a kind of calculating dismissal that did not bother to disguise itself. "Mrs. Merritt," he said, "I have made a fair offer for your land twice over the past year. The offer stands. You would be comfortable in town with that money. A woman alone managing 160 acres is a hard life." "It is my life," Susan said. "The offer does not stand. The land is not for sale." Dodd's eyes moved back to Marcus. "Sheriff, you are new to this county. I expect you are still learning how things work out here." "I understand how things work in Comanche County, Mr. Dodd," Marcus said. His voice was entirely pleasant. "I also understand how the law works in the state of Texas. Those two things are not always identical, but I am here to tell you that from this point forward they will be. Good afternoon." He turned reason and rode back toward the road. Susan rode beside him. She did not look back at Dodd on his porch, though she felt his gaze on her the whole length of his drive. When they were out of sight of the ranch, she let out a long breath she had not entirely known she was holding. "He will not stop," she said. "No," Marcus agreed. "He will not, but stopping him is not the only option. Constraining him is equally effective, making it more costly and more complicated for him to continue than to redirect his ambitions elsewhere. And the water rights case. I have a solicitor in Austin who has agreed to examine the documentation. If there are irregularities of the kind I suspect, we can bring a legal challenge that will tie up Dodd's water rights for years. He relies on those rights for the northern part of his operation. If they are in question, the value of his current holdings drops considerably, and the economics of coming after your land change." He paused. "It is a slow strategy. I am sorry for that." "Slow is not always the wrong speed," she said. "You just have to be sure you are moving in the right direction." He looked at her sideways. She was looking ahead at the road, her chin level, her back straight in the saddle, and she was extraordinary. He had known she was extraordinary for months, but each time he thought he had fully mapped the geography of it, he found some new territory he had not accounted for. "Susan," he said. She looked at him. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want you to tell me honestly if it is something you want to hear or if you would prefer I did not say it." Her expression was careful. The mockingbird-like quality of it borrowed calm over something alive and moving underneath. "Say it," she said. "I am in love with you," he said. He said it the way he said everything, without drama or decoration, just the plain fact of it placed between them. "I have been for some time. I do not expect anything from that information, and I will not raise it again if you tell me not to. But you told me that you want to know everything I know, and this is something I know, so it belongs to you." The horses moved steadily beneath them. The wind came from the west, carrying the smell of dried grass and dust and distant water. Susan looked at the road for a very long time. "I am frightened," she said finally. It was the most honest thing she had said to another person in over 2 years. "I know," he said. "I am not frightened of you," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I am frightened of the wanting. I am frightened of what happens to a person when the thing they want most can be taken away on an ordinary morning." "I cannot promise you that nothing will happen to me," he said. "I carry a badge in a frontier county, and I have a man named Dodd who currently views me as an obstacle. I will not insult you with a promise I cannot keep." She looked at him. "What can you promise me?" He thought about it. Genuinely thought about it, long enough that she knew he was not reaching for the easy answer. "I can promise you that I will not lie to you, conceal things from you, or make decisions about your life without your knowledge. I can promise you that I will be exactly what I appear to be because I do not know how to be anything else. I can promise you that whatever happens, you will always know where you stand with me." He paused. The fence was a poor way to demonstrate that, but it is what I meant by it. She thought about that, about the fence posts in the ground and the wire running clean and straight along the boundary that was hers, and the way the solid reality of it had made her feel when she walked its length in the October light. "I know," she said softly. "I knew that when I was angry about it, and I was angry anyway." "You were right to be angry," he said. "I should have asked first." She looked at him for a long moment, the two of them riding side by side through the Texas afternoon with the big sky pressing down around them in that particular, honest way it had. "I need time," she said. "I am not saying no. I am saying I need time to learn how to be a person who allows herself to want something again." "I have time," Marcus said, and he meant it without condition. "I am not going anywhere." She nodded. They rode the rest of the way back to her property line in a silence that was not empty but full of the particular warmth of something that has been named and acknowledged and does not need to be rushed. At her fence, he stopped Reason and she stopped Clover. The fence line ran between them and away in both directions, clean and straight, her boundary, her land, her life precisely mapped. "I fixed the wire this morning before I came into town," he said, "while it was still dark. I wanted you to know it was done." She looked at the southern line where Creech had cut it. She could see the new wire glinting in the late light. She looked back at him. "You are going to be very difficult to stay sensible about," she said. He smiled. That particular unexpected warmth. "I look forward to it," he said. She rode home. She did not try to put anything in a box. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was a season of slow accumulation, of things growing in the cold, of roots going deeper into frozen ground without any visible indication of what would come up in the spring. Marcus came by Susan's property twice a week on patrol, which had always been his practice, and occasionally he came on a third day that was not patrol and was not pretense, just the plain acknowledgement that he wanted to see her and she was willing to see him. They drank coffee at her kitchen table and talked about everything. About Kentucky and St. Louis, about Thomas, and about Clara Voss in Abilene, whose name Marcus offered without being pressed, because he believed she had a right to the full inventory of his history. About books, because Susan had read a great deal during the isolating months after Thomas died, and Marcus read everything he could obtain because the library of a man's mind was the only property that could never be taken from him. About the law and its inadequacies and its possibilities. About Dodd, whose legal situation Marcus updated her on regularly as he had promised. The Austin solicitor, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Adeline Cross, who had trained in her husband's law office and continued the practice after his death, found the irregularities in Dodd's water rights documentation within 2 weeks of receiving the materials Marcus had assembled. The original 1877 filing showed clear evidence of a backdated amendment that changed the scope of Dodd's claimed rights to include the Creosote Creek section that by prior documentation belonged to the general county commons. This was, as Marcus had predicted, significant. The county commissioner's office in Austin opened a formal review. Dodd hired lawyers from Fort Worth. The process moved slowly, as legal processes in 1884 Texas did, but it moved, and the direction of it was toward Dodd and not away from him. Creech served 30 days in the county jail for the destruction of property charge and left Dorado Flats upon his release, reportedly taking a position on a ranch in New Mexico. Without Creech, Dodd's operations became visibly less aggressive. The implied menace of him was still present but had lost its primary instrument. Susan's winter wheat came up well in March after the light snows of February. She walked the southern fence line in the early spring morning and felt the solid cedar posts under her hand and thought about the particular courage it took to plant something and walk away and trust that it would survive the season without you watching every moment. She had been thinking for several weeks about what Marcus had said in October on the road back from Dodd's ranch, about knowing where you stand, about the fence as a way of making that visible in the physical world. On an afternoon in late March 1884, when Marcus came by on what was officially a patrol day, she was waiting for him at the fence line instead of on the porch. She had put on her good dress, the dark blue wool one she kept for church. Her hair was pinned up with the tortoiseshell combs that had been her mother's. She had not examined too closely what any of this meant because she thought that if she examined it too closely, she would lose her nerve. He reined reason in at the fence line and looked at her. He took in the dress and the combs and her expression, and she watched him understand, very carefully and very quietly, what she was communicating. He dismounted and tied reason to the fence post. He walked through the gate that he had built into the western end of the fence, the detail he had added without her direction, a proper hinged gate so she could always move freely in and out of her own boundary. He walked up to her and stopped at a respectful distance, exactly the right distance, not too far to be cold, not close enough to presume. "I have been thinking," she said, "about what you told me on the road in November." "I remember what I told you," he said. "I have been thinking about it since October, if I am being precise," she said, "and I am trying to be precise. I told you I needed time to learn how to want something again, and I have spent the winter doing that work, and I would like to tell you that I think I have." She paused. "I am not entirely certain I will not be frightened again, but I am choosing to step through the fear rather than stay on the other side of it." He was watching her with those gray eyes that missed nothing and judged nothing. "Susan," he said. "I love you," she said, and said it with the same plainness he had used in November, fact placed between them, not performance. "I have been in love with you since at least July when you fixed my irrigation channel, and I stood on my porch being furious about it for 3 days, and I would like to stop being sensible about it." He stepped forward. He took her hands in his carefully, as though she were something he had been trusted to hold and was determined not to break. His hands were warm and calloused and certain. "Susan Merritt," he said, "you are the most remarkable person I have ever been given the chance to know." She laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and it sounded like something long locked up finally opening into air. He smiled, that unexpected warmth, and then she was not laughing anymore but looking at him, and he was looking at her, and the prairie wind moved through the new spring grass around them, and the fence stood straight and solid at their backs, marking the ground that was hers. He kissed her at the fence line, gently, with all the patience and precision that characterized everything he did, and she kissed him back with everything she had spent a year and a half learning to hold on to, the fierce, tenacious, surviving love of a woman who had chosen to remain. Spring moved into summer in Dorado Flats with a new quality to the air, something open and warm and no longer braced against itself. Marcus and Susan's courtship was the kind that a frontier town both noticed and respected, conducted with propriety and visible honesty. He came to supper 2 evenings a week. She came to church with him on Sundays and sat in the third pew, and when Miss Holt of the lending library asked Susan with bright eyes how things stood between her and the sheriff, Susan smiled in a way that answered the question without words. The Dodd situation moved toward its resolution through the summer as the county review ground forward. In August of 1884, the Austin Land Commissioner issued a ruling that Dodd's water rights claim to the Creosote Creek section was based on fraudulent documentation and was therefore void. The rights reverted to the county commons, which meant that all landholders in the south half of the county, including Susan, had equal access to the creek under common law. Dodd's lawyers filed an appeal. The appeal was denied in October. Dodd, faced with the cost of continued legal battles and the removal of the economic advantage that had made his aggressive land acquisition strategy viable, quietly reduced his operations over the following year, and eventually sold a significant portion of his holdings in 1885 and relocated to New Mexico. This was not dramatic. It was not the cinematic confrontation that stories tend to prefer. It was the slow, grinding victory of the law applied patiently and correctly over time. Marcus explained it to Susan with a quiet satisfaction that she thought was one of the most attractive things she had ever observed in a human being. "He will not come back?" she asked. "It is not profitable to come back," Marcus said, "and Dodd is, above everything else, a man who calculates his profits." "Good," she said. She looked out the window at the fence line, visible from the kitchen, the cedar posts solid and weathered now, the wire settled into the land as though it had always been there. "Good." Marcus proposed to Susan on a Saturday evening in September of 1884, in her kitchen, which was where they had most of their important conversations, because the kitchen was the honest room of a house, the room where actual life happened without ceremony or pretense. He had a ring that had been his grandmother's, a simple gold band set with a small garnet that he had carried from Kentucky in a coat pocket for more years than he wanted to count, not knowing why he could not leave it behind but unable to. He understood now why he could not leave it behind. He put it on the table between them with the same directness he brought to everything. "I would like to marry you," he said, "if you will have me." She looked at the ring for a moment. Then she looked at him. "Will you always talk to me the way you talk to me now?" she said. "Like I am a full person whose mind is worth engaging with." "I do not know how to talk to you any other way," he said. "Will you always tell me what you know, even when you think knowing it might worry me?" "Even then," he said. "I learned that lesson." She picked up the ring. She turned it in the lamplight, watching the garnet catch the glow. "Yes," she said. "Marcus, yes." He put the ring on her finger. He held her hand in both of his and looked at her over the kitchen table and felt, with a certainty that was not hope or wish but plain clear fact, that this was the best thing he had ever done. They were married on a Thursday in November 1884 by Reverend Hayes in the Methodist Church in Dorado Flats. It was not a large wedding by the standards Susan sent. Louis family might have imagined, but it was attended by most of Dorado Flats, because Marcus Wallace had kept the peace and the law with integrity for 2 years, and the town had developed a genuine affection for him that they turned out to express in their Sunday best. Pete Haverson stood as witness and cried quietly through the vows, which he later blamed on dust. Susan wore a dress she had made herself from deep green wool, and her mother's tortoiseshell combs in her hair, and she walked into that church alone because she had no family nearby to walk her in, and she had decided that walking herself in was not a sad thing but a true one. She was a woman who had chosen this. She walked herself to it. Marcus watched her come down the aisle with an expression that the assembled congregation of Dorado Flats had never seen on his face before, and would discuss with warmth for years afterward. It was an expression of unmistakable and complete love, worn without armor or concealment, by a man who had finally stopped being careful with himself. After the ceremony, there was a gathering at the Blue Star Hotel's dining room, and someone produced a fiddle, and the evening was warm and easy, and full of the kind of laughter that belongs to people who have worked hard enough to deserve celebration. Marcus and Susan rode home to her property in the dark, under a sky so thick with stars that it seemed almost impossibly generous, and when they came through the gate in the fence, the cedar posts rising on either side of them in the starlight, she reached out and touched one of them as she passed. "Still standing straight," she said. "I put them in deep," he said. She smiled in the dark. "Come inside," she said. "Come home." The years that followed were built one season at a time, with the same solidity as the fence posts, with the same careful attention to what mattered and what needed protecting. In the spring of 1886, their first child was born, a boy they named Thomas Daniel Wallace. Thomas for Susan's first husband because that name deserved to be honored in the house it had helped build. Daniel for Marcus's brother whose ghost had shaped the man Marcus had become. Thomas Daniel was a loud, determined baby who grew into a loud, determined toddler, and both of his parents found this deeply satisfying. He had his father's gray eyes and his mother's utter certainty about what he wanted, and when he wanted it. Marcus remained sheriff of Dorado Flats through the rest of the 1880s, his reputation growing commensurate with the county's growth. Dorado Flats was no longer quite as flat or isolated as it had been. The railroad reached the county seat in 1887, and the town filled in around itself the way frontier towns did when they stopped being quite so frontier, with more buildings and more people, and more of the ordinary complexity of settled life. Marcus navigated this evolution with the same steady fairness he had always brought to the work, and the new residents of Comanche County learned what the old ones had learned before them, that the law in Dorado Flats was something you could trust. Susan expanded her operation steadily and without drama, adding to the wheat crop, planting a proper orchard along the eastern quarter, acquiring 2 more milk cows and eventually a small hired hand, a 17-year-old boy from Arkansas named Walt who turned out to be extremely competent and not much for conversation, which Susan had come to appreciate as a quality. She sold produce through the Dorado Flats General Store and eventually arranged a regular supply agreement with the Blue Star Hotel. By 1888, she was operating the most productive small farm in the south part of the county, and when people in town spoke of the Merritt place, they spoke of it with a specific respect that had nothing to do with sympathy. In 1888, they had a second child, a girl they named Ada Eleanor Wallace, after Marcus's mother. Ada was quieter than her brother but paid attention to everything, which Marcus recognized as the most important intellectual quality a person could possess. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's stillness, and she sat on the porch at 18 months old watching the world go by with an expression of serious engagement that made both her parents laugh quietly into their coffee. The fence Marcus had built in October of 1883 was repaired and reinforced over the years as weather and time required. The original cedar posts eventually needed replacing, and Marcus did it one summer in 1889, digging the old posts out and setting new ones with Thomas Daniel, who was 3 years old and believed himself to be providing essential assistance. The fence line remained true. Marcus checked it against the survey map every time he worked on it. Susan walked it every spring, testing the wire, touching the posts, feeling the solid boundary of her own ground. She had stopped being afraid of wanting things. She had not stopped being honest about the fact that wanting things was terrifying. She had simply learned, through the specific education of loving Marcus Wallace and being loved by him in return, that the terror was not a warning to stop. The terror was the price of admission to everything that mattered. She told him this one evening, sitting on the porch in the summer of 1889, while Thomas Daniel slept inside, and Ada Eleanor made small contentment sounds in her cradle. The night was warm and full of insect sound, and the sky above the Texas plain was doing its generous, extravagant thing with the stars. "I have been thinking," she said, "about something you said to me on the road the day we went to see Dodd." He turned to look at her. "About Dodd, about standing, about always knowing where you stand." She looked at the fence line, visible as a dark thread against the night sky. "That is what you built for me, you know, not just the fence, the certainty." Not security exactly, because security is what Dodd was offering, a cage with comfortable walls, but certainty, about where I am, about where you are, about what is ours and what it means. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with those eyes that had spent 6 years learning the particular vocabulary of her expressions. "I was terrified," he said, "that first morning, that I had built the wrong thing entirely." "You built the right thing the wrong way," she said, "and then you built it the right way. Both parts matter." He reached over and took her hand, his thumb moving over the garnet ring that was warm from the night air and from her skin. "Are you happy?" he said. He asked it regularly, not from insecurity, but from the genuine ongoing interest of a man who considered her happiness something worth actively monitoring and tending. "Extraordinarily," she said, and meant it with everything she had. He lifted her hand and kissed her knuckles, the gesture so familiar now and still, after 5 years of marriage, capable of landing somewhere in the center of her with a warmth that never went ordinary. "I love you, Susan," he said. "I love you, Marcus," she said. Inside the house, Thomas Daniel stirred and called out sleepily for water, and Ada Alina, disturbed by her brother's voice, added her own more energetic opinion of the situation, and both parents rose from their porch chairs with the particular mix of tired amusement that belongs to people in the middle of the life they have chosen. Marcus went inside to settle the children while Susan brought the cradle in from the porch. She paused at the door with Ada Alina in her arms, looking out at the night, at the fence line, at the stars, at the piece of Texas earth that was hers because she had stayed for it and fought for it and planted herself in it and refused to leave. She thought of Thomas, under his post oak on the western edge. She thought of what he had wanted when he brought them here, the permanence of being planted, the particular truth of ground that knows you. She thought that he had been right about that in his direct and uncomplicated way. He had been absolutely right about the land. And she thought of Marcus, inside their house, talking to their son in the patient, quiet voice that their son trusted completely, and she thought that she had also been right, eventually, about him, about the necessity of him, about what it meant to love someone with your eyes open, knowing the risk and choosing it anyway. She brought Ada inside and settled her, and Marcus came out of Thomas Daniel's room with his sleeves rolled up and his hair slightly disarranged by the small hands that had reached for him, and he looked at her across the lamplight and smiled. She went to him. She had long since stopped being surprised by how natural it felt to go to him, to close the distance between them as easily as walking, as easily as breathing. "Come to bed," she said. "Yes," he said, and he meant a great deal more than just sleep, and she knew it, and the knowing of it was warm and familiar and entirely hers. The seasons continued to turn. Thomas Daniel grew from a loud, determined baby into a loud, determined boy who turned out to have a gift for mathematics and a deep fascination with the natural world that led him to fill every available notebook with observations about the behavior of insects, weather patterns, and the growth rates of various crops. By the time he was 7, he was following his mother around the farm asking questions she had to think carefully about to answer, which she found deeply pleasing. Ada Alina, at 4 and then 5, was a different creature entirely, quieter and more observant, the child who noticed things before anyone else did and said nothing until she had thought about them completely, which was so recognizably her father's pattern that it made Susan smile every time she saw it. Ada Alina was devoted to her brother in the particular way of younger siblings who are simultaneously older in temperament than their older siblings, watching out for him while he charged at the world without sufficient preparation. Marcus was promoted in 1890 to district sheriff, which gave him authority over 3 counties and required more time in the county seat and occasionally in Austin. This was the first significant structural change to their life, and Susan and Marcus approached it the way they had learned to approach every significant change, by talking about it thoroughly and honestly, including the parts that were hard to say. "It will mean more travel," Marcus said. "More time I'm not here." "How much more?" she said. 3 or 4 days a month to start, possibly a week at a time if there is something serious in the other counties." She thought about it. "Can I travel with you when it is practical?" He had already been thinking about this. "To the county seat, yes, and often to Austin. The children are old enough to be left with Walt for short trips." "Then yes," she said, "take the position. It is right for you." "Are you certain?" "Marcus," she said, You are the most effective lawman in this part of Texas. Keeping you to one county when 3 counties need you would be like using your survey map to swat flies. Take the position." He looked at her with that expression that still, after 7 years, had the power to make her feel like the most clearly seen person in any room. "You are remarkable," he said. "I know," she said. "Take the position." He did. And Susan was right, as she generally was about the things she had thought carefully about. The expanded position suited him in the way that a larger task often reveals a person's truer capacity. He was good at it. And he came home to her, and to their children with a regularity that she trusted, because he had never once failed to come home when he said he would come home. In 1892, when Susan was 37 and Marcus was 41, she told him one morning over coffee that there was going to be another child. He was quiet for a long moment in the way of a man absorbing something enormous, and then he looked up at her with the expression of someone discovering that the world is even better than they had understood it to be. When he said, "March," she said, "I think." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Are you well?" "Entirely," she said. "I feel extremely well." He held her hand in both of his and said nothing for a moment, which was the way of his deepest feeling, expressed in stillness rather than declaration. "Then Thomas Daniel will feel this is a great development. Ada will have opinions about names." "Ada always has opinions about names," Susan said. "She renamed all 6 of the chickens last week." He laughed, genuine and easy, and she thought, as she always did, that the laugh was the best argument for having weathered everything that had stood between them, because she had not known, in October of 1883, that she would one day be sitting in her kitchen married to the author of that laugh, holding his hand over coffee while their children slept upstairs. The 3rd child arrived in February of 1893, a boy, arriving slightly early and with considerable urgency, as though he had decided the schedule was merely a suggestion. They named him James Elliott Wallace, James for no particular historical reason, but because it suited him from the first moment, and Elliott for Mrs. Adeline Cross in Austin, who had found the water rights irregularities, and whose middle name, it turned out, was Elliott, a family name she wore with considerable pride. James was, from the beginning, an entirely different person from his siblings. Where Thomas Daniel was loud and forward-moving, and Ada Alina was quiet and watchful, James was sunny. There was no other word for it. He was the kind of child who greeted every morning as a personal gift, who found reasons to laugh in everything, who reached for the world with both hands and an enormous smile. He was, Marcus said once, the child that hope looks like when it has a face. Susan looked at her 3 children in those years of the early 1890s and felt something she had once told herself she could not afford to feel. She felt complete. Not finished, because life in Dorado Flats was still alive and moving and bringing her new challenges with the reliability of Texas seasons. But complete in the sense of having become fully herself, of having planted everything she intended to plant and watched it take root. The fence was repaired again in 1894. Thomas Daniel, now 8 years old and deeply invested in contributing to the operation of the farm, helped his father with the new posts, taking the work seriously with his mother's expression of concentrated attention. Ada, 6, inspected each post critically and offered commentary. James, 1 year old, sat in a wooden box on the wagon and ate dirt when he thought no one was watching, which was never. Marcus drove the last post in and stood back to look at the line. It ran straight and clean from the creek bend to the eastern corner, the same line it had always run, the same boundary that had been there since the original survey. "Why do we always fix it the same way?" Thomas Daniel asked, with the focused intellectual curiosity that was his primary mode of engaging with the world. "Because it is the right line," Marcus said. "The boundary. Your mother's boundary," Marcus said. He looked at Susan, standing at the gate, Ada at her side, James on her hip pulling at her hair with small, determined fingers. "The place where she knows where she stands. That should always be kept clear." Thomas Daniel considered this with the seriousness he brought to all things worth thinking about. "So she always knows where she is," he said. "And what is hers," Marcus said, "and what no one can take from her." Thomas Daniel nodded. He picked up the mallet. "Can I do the next one?" "When you are taller," Marcus said. "I am growing very fast," Thomas Daniel said. "You are," Marcus agreed. "Come on then." Susan watched them, her son and her husband, moving down the fence line together in the afternoon light. Ada leaned against her side, watching them too, with her father's quiet attention. James finally succeeded in extracting a tortoiseshell comb and looked at it with the deep satisfaction of achieved goals. The land stretched away around them in every direction, honest and wide and full of sky. The fence ran straight and true along her boundary. The post oak on the western edge had put out new growth this spring, green and reaching upward toward the enormous Texas light. She was, Susan Merritt Wallace thought, on the exact ground she was supposed to be standing on. She had found it through loss and labor and a winter of learning to want things again, and she had built her life on it one season at a time, and it had held. It would keep holding. She was sure of it. Marcus walked back to her at the end of the fence line, hat in hand, gray eyes warm in the late afternoon light. He was 43 now, and the silver at his temples had expanded into a proper part of him, and she thought he was more himself at 43 than he had been at 32, the way good tools become more themselves with use. "Done for another season," he said. "Thank you," she said, the way she had thanked him after the very first fence, except now the words carried everything that had happened since, and he knew it, and she knew he knew it. He put his arm around her shoulders. James immediately grabbed for his sleeve. Ada said thoughtfully that she thought the fourth post from the east was perhaps slightly crooked and someone should look at it. Thomas Daniel called from down the line that he had found an interesting beetle. Marcus and Susan looked at each other, and the look between them was the whole of it, the history and the work and the choosing, the patience and the plain truth of two people who had each been broken and had each been rebuilt by the specific grace of being known completely by the right person at the right time. "Come inside," she said. "Supper." "What is for supper?" Ada asked. "Everything that is good," Susan said, which was not an answer but was, in the precise and particular language of this family in this place, entirely true. They walked together through the gate, through the fence, onto the land that was hers and theirs, into the evening that was ordinary and extraordinary in equal measure, into the life they had built one honest day at a time. The door of the house closed behind them all. The fence stood in the last light of the Texas afternoon, solid and straight, marking a boundary that would never need defending again. The stars came out one by one over Dorado Flats, and the land was quiet, and everything that had been planted had taken root, and everything that had been chosen had become permanent, and Susan Merritt Wallace stood in her own kitchen with her family around her table and knew, with complete and unshakable certainty, exactly where she stood. She always would.